and comfort we have needed.
The decision did not arrive with trumpets, ceremony, or a royal procession. It came behind a closed palace door, carried inside a dark folder, and placed directly before King Charles. Moments later, the monarchy had shifted. Camilla's queenly privileges were removed by Charles himself after an internal palace uprising led by Princess and pushed the king into making the harshest decision of his reign. Before we go further into what this truly means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. Charles knew everyone inside Buckingham Palace understood the risk. Heated disagreements had spread throughout the royal circle over Camilla's expanding influence, and the king entered that morning exhausted, his patience almost gone. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's main working residence and administrative headquarters, had become the center of a family crisis because authority there shaped appointments and royal power, and stood nearby in silence while William watched his father measure every breath. The decision was precise. Charles signed a royal directive, an official written instruction issued under the sovereign's authority, removing the Queen Consort's independent palace authority, ceremonial decision-making privileges, and direct control over senior household appointments, and had not arrived with anger alone. She carried a written statement supported by senior working royals, turning private resistance into an organized challenge the monarch could no longer ignore. William had not led the challenge, but his presence made the pressure impossible to overlook. Charles read the final page alone. His fingers tightened around the pen, yet he remained still, and understood exactly what that pause meant. Her brother was not simply limiting a royal office. He was hurting the woman he had spent years defending. Then the king signed. He closed the folder, looked toward his sister, and quietly said, "There will be no second directive," and did not smile. Those words confirmed the restrictions were final. With no immediate path for Camilla to recover what had been removed, she received the news inside a private sitting room. She stared at the aide before asking, "He signed it?" The answer came softly, but it struck like a blow. Charles had personally approved every restriction. She remained motionless, anger and disbelief filling the silence while the king stayed elsewhere, fully aware the first shock had reached her. Yet the directive was only the visible result of a much deeper personal conflict. Anne's challenge had forced Charles, Camilla, and William onto opposite sides of a struggle none of them would leave unchanged. But to understand why Anne was willing to corner her own brother, we must first understand exactly what each of them believed they were about to lose. For Charles, this was never only about palace authority. It was about the woman beside him and the sister who had stood beside the crown for decades. Camilla represented the personal life he had fought to protect, and represented duty without compromise. Now those two loyalties had collided so fiercely that the king was being forced to decide which relationship could survive his reign. Charles had spent years shielding Camilla from criticism and resentment, making the directive feel deeply personal. The crown, meaning the monarchy as an institution, required clear authority because blurred control could weaken confidence within the royal household. Yet the king understood every restriction placed on the queen consort could appear to be an admission that his protection had finally failed, and felt no satisfaction. She had built her life around service, discipline, and the belief that royal responsibility must always outweigh personal emotion. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally held by the monarch's eldest daughter, viewed delay as a danger because unresolved tensions could quickly grow into a crisis. She had watched her brother hesitate, and she believed that hesitation now threatened more than his marriage. Charles had spoken privately with William before the meeting that sparked the uprising. He admitted humiliating Camilla terrified him. The prince carefully chose his words before telling his father that allowing uncertainty to continue might ultimately humiliate the monarchy instead. Charles looked away, but William did not soften the warning. The future king understood today's uncertainty could become tomorrow's burden. Camilla remained alone after receiving the decision. She removed a bracelet from her wrist and placed it firmly on the table, anger breaking through the silence. The queen consort had expected resistance from Anne, but never a signed directive from her own husband. She felt deeply betrayed because Charles had allowed the challenge to reach its conclusion while leaving her outside the final discussion. Days earlier, and had quietly tested William. During a private conversation with no aides present, she asked whether he would support structural restrictions if Charles refused to act. The prince offered no direct answer. Instead, he simply held her gaze. His silence gave the princess all the confirmation she needed. Later, Charles learned that Anne had already spoken with several senior working royals. This was not an emotional protest. She had carefully built a wall of resistance around Camilla's authority. That discovery unsettled the king because it proved concern had spread far beyond one sister. The question suddenly became impossible to ignore. What had convinced and that private concern was no longer enough, and that open resistance had become necessary? The answer began with a single ceremony, one argument behind closed doors, and one instruction from Camilla that, and would later describe as the point of no return. Every palace conflict has one defining moment that different people remember in completely different ways. For Charles, it was simply an unfortunate disagreement. For Camilla, it was a matter of authority. But for Anne, the Windsor reception became something far more dangerous. She watched a single instruction being issued, one senior official removed from the room, and an important royal protocol altered without consultation. From that instant, the princess stopped arguing behind closed doors and began preparing for open resistance, and entered the Windsor planning meeting already uneasy. The Windsor Service of Continuity, a ceremony symbolizing royal duty passing from one generation to the next, carried enormous importance because ceremonial roles often hinted at future influence. Camilla understood that sensitivity. Even so, the Queen ordered and nominated ceremonial coordinator to be removed and replaced with someone from her own household without first consulting Charles or William, and refused to let the moment pass. She slid the revised program across the briefing table and fixed her eyes on Camilla. "Who approved this?" she asked. Camilla barely hesitated. "I did." Silence filled the room, and understood that the program represented far more than a simple schedule. It was an official document showing exactly who would stand where and who would control the ceremony's decisions. Charles arrived only after the disagreement had already hardened. He attempted to calm his sister, insisting that one personnel change was not enough to tear the family apart, and looked directly at him before replying. Refusing to choose is still a choice. The king visibly recoiled because he realized she was no longer asking him to mediate. She was accusing him of allowing the conflict to grow. That evening, and requested the household authority protocols, the internal regulations explaining which royal office possessed the authority to direct staff and approve appointments. As she carefully reviewed the records, she discovered several decisions had passed through Camilla's office before reaching the king's private secretary. The discovery mattered because Charles had always believed those decisions had followed the normal chain of command, and now feared that influence was beginning to shape important decisions before the monarch ever had the opportunity to review them himself. William agreed to meet her privately, without aids, and quietly placed the Windsor program before him without saying a single word. The prince read it once, then again. Finally, he placed it back on the table. "Father has to recognize the pattern." Those few words changed everything. The future king had not openly joined Anne's campaign, but he had stopped dismissing her concerns, and immediately understood Charles would feel that shift the moment he discovered it. She left the meeting with complete determination. She knew the next conversation could damage her relationship with Charles, deepen Camilla's anger, and force William into a conflict he had tried desperately to avoid. But after what had happened at Windsor, there was no turning back. When Anne finally entered Charles's private room carrying the Windsor program in her hand, she had not come to negotiate. She had come to force the truth into the open. There were no aides between them, no private secretaries, and no carefully prepared briefing notes to soften the conversation, and quietly closed the door behind her before placing the Windsor program directly in front of Charles. The king stared at it for several seconds, already knowing why his sister had come. But what followed was no ordinary disagreement over palace protocol. It became a painful confrontation over whether Charles was still fully in control of his own court. Charles leaned back, trying to contain the growing damage. He insisted that household disagreements had been exaggerated and could still be resolved privately. The royal household, meaning the network of officers and staff serving the monarch and senior royals, depended upon clear lines of authority because even one unclear instruction could create confusion throughout appointments, ceremonies, and future planning, and allowed him to finish. Then she calmly pushed the Windsor program closer. She explained that the problem was no longer one altered schedule or one removed coordinator. Camilla's office had begun influencing important decisions before they even reached the king's own private secretary. The senior advisor responsible for managing the monarch's official work had been bypassed, and looked directly into her brother's eyes. "Tell me you personally approve this." Charles lowered his gaze toward the document. He said nothing, and waited. His silence became all the answer she needed. The king slowly rose from his chair. For the first time, frustration replaced restraint. He accused and of turning family concern into open rebellion, and refused to back away. She answered that she would rather face accusations of rebellion than quietly watch the monarchy's chain of authority, the formal system showing who possessed the power to approve decisions, begin weakening around them. Charles stood frozen. The accusation hurt because it came from someone who understood him better than almost anyone else. Then and revealed something even more difficult. She told Charles that William had personally reviewed the Windsor changes. The prince shared her concerns. Charles stopped moving. His own son had moved closer to Anne's position without confronting him directly. That mattered because the future king would eventually inherit every unresolved weakness left behind by this reign. And repeated William's words exactly. Father has to see the pattern. Then she reached into her folder and placed another document on the table. It contained a detailed list of proposed restrictions. She wanted immediate limits placed on Camilla's independent authority over senior appointments and ceremonial decisions. Charles refused to read it, and quietly turned toward the door. Just before she reached it, the king's hand moved. He reached for the document. Charles was now holding the very framework that could become the final royal directive. Only one private conversation remained. He could reject Anne's proposal, defend Camilla completely, and risk deepening the palace uprising. Or he could sign away powers his wife believed she had every right to keep. That night, Charles asked Camilla to meet him alone. She entered the room expecting reassurance. Through public criticism, private resentment, and years of royal controversy, Charles had always defended her. She believed this meeting would be no different. But the king did not rise to greet her. A single document rested beside his hand. The moment Camilla recognized Anne's handwriting attached to the notes, her expression changed. Before Charles spoke a single word, she already knew his sister had reached him. Camilla stopped beside the chair and waited. Charles still possessed the sole authority required to turn Anne's proposal into reality. In this struggle, royal authority meant the king's constitutional power to approve household rules and determine who could direct palace affairs, and could build pressure. William could quietly support reform, but neither could remove the queen consort's operating powers unless the monarch himself chose institutional order over marital peace. Camilla looked directly at her husband. Do you trust Anne more than your own wife? Charles lowered his eyes toward the document. This has never been about trust, he answered quietly. It is about whether anyone should exercise authority that was never clearly defined. She heard the meaning hidden beneath his careful words. The king was no longer defending the previous arrangement. Camilla's disappointment quickly turned into anger. She reminded Charles that she had remained beside him through years of criticism and public hostility, only to be treated now as though she had become a threat inside his own court. Charles reached out toward her. She stepped back. His hand remained suspended for a brief moment before slowly falling to his side. The king explained that he had personally reviewed appointment records from recent months. He had discovered several decisions he once believed were routine had actually been influenced by Camilla's office before reaching him for approval. Those records mattered because senior appointments determined who carried instructions throughout the palace. Charles now feared influence had begun moving ahead of his own knowledge. Camilla firmly insisted she had acted only to protect him from unnecessary administrative burdens. Every decision, she claimed, had been intended to save him time, not weaken his authority. Charles looked at her quietly before replying. Then you should have told me. The room fell silent. Those few words ended the argument. The king pulled Anne's proposed restrictions closer. Then he began revising the final wording with his own pen. Charles continued working until the document was complete. Camilla watched in silence. She realized that every stroke of his pen was doing far more than editing a proposal. It was creating the royal directive that would permanently limit her authority before the next sunrise. She walked away knowing and had forced the confrontation. But her husband had made the final decision. Because the moment that directive came into effect, the palace would no longer respond to her commands the way it once had. The new reality arrived without warning. Before lunchtime, Camilla instructed that a senior household official be summoned. Her aide hesitated. She repeated the instruction more slowly. Still, nothing happened. Then came the sentence that made the king's directive painfully real. The request now requires approval from the king's household office. Camilla stared at the aide as though the palace itself had suddenly stopped recognizing her authority. She dismissed everyone from the room. The King's Household Office, the department responsible for managing the monarch's official duties and approving internal instructions, now controlled requests her staff had once carried out immediately. Charles's directive had removed her independent authority over certain appointments, ceremonial changes, and cross-household instructions. That change mattered because influence inside the palace depended not on who spoke with confidence, but on whose orders staff were officially required to follow. Camilla quietly closed the door herself and remained standing beside her desk. Anger surfaced first. Then came humiliation. For years, the Queen Consort had believed her position carried unquestioned influence. Now, one signed royal directive had forced her own aide to question her instructions before acting. She gripped the edge of the desk tightly. A few seconds later, she slowly released it. Not long afterward, Charles arrived and stopped outside the private sitting room. He gently asked if they could speak. Camilla refused to unlock the door. "You have turned me into a visitor inside my own royal life," she said through the closed door. The king remained standing there in complete silence. He understood that her accusation reached far beyond official authority. His wife believed he had chosen the institution at the very moment she needed him to choose her. Elsewhere, and received confirmation that the new measures had already been implemented. She learned the safeguards had taken effect even faster than expected. William had also been given responsibility for the revised chain of approval, the formal process every important decision would now follow, and showed no sign of celebration. Instead, she quietly told the prince that Charles would continue carrying the emotional burden long after the palace stopped discussing the directive. William then pointed toward one final safeguard included within the signed order. No authority removed from the Queen Consort could ever be restored through a private favour or an informal instruction. Any future reversal would require a written royal review personally approved by Charles himself. The future king immediately understood the importance of that provision. The new boundaries could not simply disappear because guilt or emotion entered the room. And noticed something else hidden inside that safeguard. Charles had not merely accepted pressure. He had deliberately made it difficult for himself to retreat. Later, and met privately with her brother. She immediately sensed the difference. Charles no longer wished to discuss Camilla's authority. Instead, he wanted to explain why he had waited so long. For the first time since the palace uprising had begun, the conflict stopped being about Camilla. It became an honest conversation between a brother and the sister who had forced him to make the hardest decision of his reign, for the first time since the palace uprising began, and entered Charles's private room without carrying a folder. There was no decree waiting on the table. No advisers stood nearby. No palace officials remained outside the door. For a few quiet moments, they met simply as brother and sister, not as king and princess royal. After a long silence, Charles finally admitted the fear he had hidden throughout every argument. He had recognized the boundaries becoming blurred. He had seen the warning signs. But he delayed taking action because he could not bear to hurt Camilla once again. Charles lowered his eyes and remained completely silent. The royal directive, the formal written order carrying the monarch's authority, had already changed Camilla's role. But this conversation was no longer about official paperwork. It mattered because the king had signed away powers that affected his own marriage, and because his sister had forced him to confront a weakness he had tried for years to manage in private, and quietly acknowledged that the uprising had placed enormous pressure upon him. She admitted she understood the personal cost of challenging her own brother, but she also believed that only a united stand from within the family could finally break his habit of postponing painful decisions. Charles listened without interrupting. Not once. And explained that waiting any longer would only have made the eventual decision even more damaging. Charles looked toward the window. Every restriction, he admitted, felt like another judgment upon his marriage. He feared Camilla would never see the directive as necessary reform. Instead, she would view it as proof that the royal family had never fully accepted her. He confessed that he had spent years protecting his wife from criticism. Now, he had become the one responsible for causing her deepest pain. For the first time, Anne's expression softened. She quietly told Charles she had never launched the uprising to destroy Camilla. Her purpose had never been revenge. She believed uncertainty itself had become more dangerous than conflict because unclear authority weakened the monarchy and left William to inherit problems that should have been solved during Charles's reign. The king slowly lowered his head. He knew she was right. The future monarch would inherit not only the crown, But every unresolved issue Charles failed to settle himself. Then Charles revealed something and had never expected. One section of the final directive, the harshest section, had not come from her proposal. He had personally strengthened it. Instead of allowing a gradual transition, Charles himself ordered immediate enforcement, and stared at her brother in complete silence. For the first time, he was no longer blaming palace pressure. He was no longer hiding behind the uprising. He accepted full responsibility for the decision. At that very moment, and understood something important. The battle was finally over. Not because someone had won, but because Charles had finally made peace with the choice he knew he could no longer avoid. By the time and quietly left the room, Buckingham Palace had already begun preparing to announce the restructuring publicly. What had started behind closed doors was about to become a national debate, and one image outside the palace gates would soon capture the shock of the entire country. By the following morning, the directive that had been signed behind closed doors dominated every major broadcast. Britain had chosen one place above all others to express its reaction: the gates of Buckingham Palace. As the sun rose, the debate no longer belonged only to the royal family. It belonged to the entire nation. The restrictions placed upon Camilla were no longer whispered through palace corridors. They now filled breakfast television, newspaper headlines, and conversations across the country. Yet one single moment captured the public mood more clearly than anything else. A crowd gathered behind the palace barriers. One woman slowly raised a newspaper high above her head. Across the front page, enormous words stretched from edge to edge: "Charles chooses the crown." Charles watched the morning coverage alone. Buckingham Palace had officially confirmed a restructuring of Camilla's royal operating authority, meaning the practical responsibilities her office could exercise over staff, ceremonies, and senior household decisions. The official statement described the move as a clarification of authority, rather than an attack on the king's marriage. That distinction mattered because Charles wanted to protect the institution without publicly humiliating his wife. He continued listening until one television presenter described him as the monarch who finally placed duty above personal loyalty. Charles quietly reached for the remote. He switched off the television. The king remained seated in complete silence. Months of hesitation, fear, and private conflict had just been reduced to a single sentence. Anne's determination had forced the decision. William's quiet support had already become part of the national conversation about the monarchy's future. Camilla also saw the newspaper photograph from outside the palace. Without saying a word, she folded the newspaper once, placed it face down upon the table, then instructed her aide to cancel a private luncheon. The Queen Consort refused to spend the day pretending she had not been affected. She understood that the headline had transformed her personal humiliation into a national symbol. Every repeated broadcast made Charles's decision feel even more permanent. Soon afterward, another television bulletin displayed the revised royal authority structure, the updated change showing which officers now possessed approval over palace decisions. The presenter described Anne's uprising as the most significant internal challenge of Charles's reign. Later, Anne heard those exact words. She took no satisfaction from them. She understood that success had arrived only through her brother's pain. Where the public saw rebellion, she had seen necessity. William responded with remarkable restraint. He instructed his office not to criticize Camilla publicly. He also prohibited any triumphant language from appearing in official responses. To the future king, the directive represented a necessary correction, not a family victory. His restraint protected Charles, prevented deeper division, and reminded everyone that restoring order never required public humiliation. His silence proved just as important as his words. It denied the public another confrontation, and kept the focus on authority instead of revenge. As public attention reached its highest point, Charles and Camilla all recognized the same unavoidable truth. The directive remained in force. The uprising had achieved its purpose. Now, only the emotional consequences remained. When the palace gates finally closed after the loudest day of the crisis, there was nothing left to debate. Only the lasting meaning of the choice Charles had made. There was no second directive.
No confidential reversal.
No late-night instruction restoring the authority Camilla had lost. Charles allowed every restriction to remain exactly as written, and ended her organized campaign. William quietly stepped away from the conflict. Camilla, confronted by a royal structure that no longer answered to her in the same way, faced the most difficult truth of all. Her husband's love had endured, but her unrestricted palace influence had not. Charles refused to alter the directive. His decision remained fully in effect. Camilla's restricted queen consort privileges were never reinstated. The formal approval system, the established chain showing who possessed authority to authorize palace decisions, now governed every affected instruction. Private influence could no longer replace written authority. The king understood that reversing course would reopen the very crisis and had forced him to confront. The moment the directive took effect, and brought her organized challenge to an end. She demanded no additional punishment. She sought no public humiliation. The princess had always wanted clearly defined boundaries, not revenge. Her refusal to press further revealed the true purpose behind everything she had done. She had fought to strengthen the institution, not to destroy Camilla. Later, Charles visited his wife one final time in private. He quietly told her the directive would remain. But so would he. Camilla answered without hesitation. Remaining beside someone is not the same as standing on the same side. Charles accepted the words without offering a defense. Their marriage had survived. Yet something deep within it had been damaged in a way that would not easily heal. Sometime afterward, and crossed paths with her brother inside a palace corridor. For several moments, neither of them spoke. At last, Charles gave a small nod, and returned it. That silent exchange carried both pain and understanding. The king had acted out of love and duty. His sister had acted from duty and concern. Each had finally understood the other's burden while trying to protect the crown. William accepted the new structure without celebration. The prince understood the precedent, a decision that would shape the handling of similar situations in the future. Closeness to the monarch could never replace clearly defined authority. The future king believed visible boundaries protected the institution. Even when those boundaries cut deeply through a family, Camilla eventually stopped challenging the directive. She understood that forcing Charles to make the same choice again would only reopen a wound that had already changed them both. And she already knew what his answer would be, and had won the institutional struggle. Camilla had lost the authority she believed she had earned. Charles had paid the greatest personal price of all. The monarchy endured because personal affection was no longer allowed to determine official power. That became the lasting meaning of the palace uprising, and had forced the decision. Camilla had lived with the consequences, and Charles proved, at enormous emotional cost, that the crown would never again be guided by silence. The king never amended the directive. The revised structure remained fully in place. Every affected instruction continued passing through the formal approval system, the official chain that determined who possessed the authority to authorize palace decisions. Private influence could no longer take the place of written authority. Charles understood that reversing his own decision would immediately revive the crisis and had compelled him to face, and never returned to demand additional restrictions. Her purpose had been accomplished. She wanted stability, not revenge. Once clear boundaries had been restored, she stepped away without asking for anything more. That choice revealed the truth behind her actions. She had fought to protect the institution, not to defeat Camilla. In one final private meeting, Charles quietly told his wife that although the directive would remain unchanged, he would remain beside her. Camilla looked at him before replying softly. Standing beside someone is very different from standing with them. The king offered no argument. He simply accepted her words. Their marriage continued. But something between them had changed in a way neither of them could easily repair. Not long afterward, and Charles crossed paths inside the palace. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Charles gave a small, respectful nod, and returned it. Without saying a single word, both understood what the other had carried throughout the crisis. Charles had chosen duty while protecting love, and had chosen duty because she feared what silence might eventually cost. William accepted the new structure without celebration. He understood that this decision would become an important precedent for future generations. Personal closeness to the monarch could never replace clearly defined authority. Strong institutions depended upon visible boundaries, even when those boundaries carried painful consequences for a family. The crisis had ended. The directive remained. The palace moved forward. but the emotional cost of those decisions would continue long after the headlines disappeared. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal update. We'll see you in the next video.